Future Freight Festival in Chattanooga, Tennessee is the event of the fall. Subscribers to Check Call have a special discount code for F3 registration. This is going to be one of the best deals on F3 tickets. Use the code CheckCall F324 at checkout to take advantage of this offer. See you in Chattanooga. Welcome back to another edition of Check Call. Don't forget to subscribe to Check Call, the newsletter, on FreightWaves.com if you haven't already. Today we welcome back Jordan Dewart, president of Redwood, Mexico. Welcome back to the show, Jordan.
Always a pleasure, Mary. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for today. I know I say that every time, but I do generally get excited for these conversations. But today is something that I can honestly say we have never really touched on the show. Yes, we've touched on nearshoring and the rise of Mexico. Obviously, we've talked to you about that. But this time we've kind of brought in the China effect to it. And I don't know if the China effect's even a real world. It's more like the Mexico effect on China. But that being said, I mean, you're still an expert in that. So let's just jump right in because we already know how you got to Redwood. But how has China's strategy of kind of using Mexico to circumvent some of these tariffs affected that volume that's crossing the border?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think after these tariffs were rolled out, the first companies we saw were American companies bringing production back to North America. But then we saw the rise of Chinese companies come in. Basically, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And they came over and started setting up shop in Mexico. So we've seen huge increase of volume on the west coast ports of Mexico, Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas mainly. Then as these factories started to get built, project cargo, right, coming in from the U.S. Into Mexico to set up these factories. And only this year have we really seen the volumes from finished goods production start to really show up and see a rise in northbound volume coming into the United States. So I think it's also important to note that it's not just these Chinese companies, but also European companies shifting their volumes from China over to Mexico as well.
So really Mexico has kind of become this, I don't want to call it like a Switzerland, but kind of like everybody comes there and it just kind of works out, like we just don't ask too many questions, don't go too far down that rabbit hole, and just know that if Mexican land is up for sale for anyone who may want to purchase it.
Without a doubt, yeah. I mean, there's no restrictions on any specific countries coming in. So Mexico has opened its doors to the world for sure.
Kind of in what ways has this increase in the freight volumes kind of influenced the operations of cross-border freight brokers between the U.S. and Mexico?
I think we've seen that when companies come in to Mexico from other countries, they have a tendency to do business with logistics companies from their own country, right? So when all the Japanese companies came in, they're dealing with Japanese forwarders, Korean companies the same way, German and European companies using German forwarders. We saw that same trend with the Chinese companies that have set up shop. They do have a tendency to do business with Chinese logistics companies. So we've seen a rise of that presence in Mexico for sure. But at the end of the day, we're kind of all competing for the same resources. So we're competing for the same Mexican truckers, customs brokers, and infrastructure at the border. But I think, and also, employees throughout the country as well. So there's a lot of competition for the same finite resources. And here at Redwood, I think our strategy to position ourselves as a modern 4PL has really served us well because we're able to compete at a logistics execution level, but also provide all of the technology and human services that are required to move goods across the border.
I kind of like that approach because, as you said, like Redwood has been in Mexico for quite a long time. You guys have that established relationship. You have those relationships with carriers, with shippers, and then you also have the ability to kind of flex to your workforce and everything that you have, in the U.S. or, all over the world that you guys have people. And I think that is something that cannot be kind of overvalued is that, yes, you guys are all competing with the same resources. There is those finite number of border crossings. You still have to wait in customs lines just like everybody else, but it's what you can do outside of it that really gives that value, whether it's the visibility, the tracking, the technology, or even something as simple as like, we don't have to, like, you get an express pass through the border or something like that. That is that kind of, that it's kind of that like leg up that you have of being an established company and knowing how things already operate.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think when you talk about some of the challenges that Chinese companies have had expanding into Mexico, a lot of people think that doing logistics in Mexico is just like U.S. domestic logistics in Spanish. That's kind of our running joke. But there are, like you say, there are a lot of nuances, both culturally and regulatory, that are required. So a lot of these companies have had a very steep learning curve as they set up shop in Mexico, and they really look to partner with companies like ourselves that have been in this market for decades and kind of truly know the lay of the land, so to speak, and able to support them and get them up running quickly.
You're kind of like the big brother that like everybody turns to and goes, "How do I do this?" And you guys are like, "Come here, we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it." Like, it's cute that you tried, but we got you.
Exactly.
As a result of kind of this increase of volume, has there been any kind of noticeable changes in the types of goods that or commodities that are being transported across the border? I know we recently had you over on Running on Ice, and we talked about the impacts of Mexican produce season and kind of their peak harvest season. Has there been, obviously, aside from auto part manufacturing parts, I don't exactly know what goes into those, but the automotive sector really seems to love to move to cross-border freight. But outside of those, have you guys seen any kind of noticeable changes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think from the get-go, both China and Mexico many years ago were associated with low cost, low quality, kind of cheap goods. But that has absolutely changed going forward. Now we're seeing that some of the most sophisticated products in the world are being made in Mexico, and these Chinese companies' shift of production is no exception. So electronics of all kinds are being made in Mexico, so we're seeing a shift of electronics production, and that all of a sudden means all of the component parts, like semiconductors, need to be brought into Mexico. So that was a huge shift. You mentioned automotive, which has been in Mexico for many years, but for the first time, we're seeing electric vehicles being made in Mexico, most notably BYD setting up a plant in Mexico. So that's a very different mix of component parts than your normal automotive products. But in addition to that, we're seeing things like heavy machinery that's being imported and manufactured in Mexico for all types of manufacturing, solar panels, you name it. These things are being now made in Mexico. So very expensive, high value, high sophistication goods, aerospace, for example, are all being made. So a lot of new trends in shift of products coming in.
After that laundry list of things that are being made and those trends that are happening, it kind of begs the question of what isn't being made in Mexico. Like, is there anything outside of like, something that can't survive in, variable temperatures? Because obviously Mexico has 4 seasons and it's not the same temperature all year round. Is there anything that like is not, or even the country itself has been like, we're not allowing any of this manufacturing?
No, not at this time. I think kind of two things. One is semiconductors, right? Those are primarily still made in Taiwan, still made in Southeast Asia. Those haven't been shifted to be made in Mexico yet, but I do believe that's the trend of the future. So the semiconductors, that's the last kind of component part that is still made outside of Mexico. And the other thing is, I think in Mexico, things were being made that were not allowed to be made in the US because of environmental concerns. And I think that's also changing. So Mexico is getting on the green bandwagon and is not allowing things to be produced in Mexico that pollute the country or pollute kind of our neck of the woods. So I think those are two things that maybe Mexico is pumping the brakes on.
First of all, I love anyone that's willing to pump the brakes on anything that's bad for the environment. Cannot say that enough. But I mean, I definitely have seen that in certain warehouses that have or manufacturing facilities that have proposed something to a local government, and they've said, no, you need to come up with a new plan because this resource could potentially use too much water. So you need to figure out a way to conserve more water. And I think that's one of the ones that kind of surprised me, is that not only do you have to have a plan for certain environmental levels and other different energy requirements, but you also need to have a water plan, which makes sense because a decent amount of Mexico, I want to say it's like a desert.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. More than half the country is arid desert. Yes.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit already, but what challenges or kind of opportunities have emerged for logistic companies because of these trade shifts? So I know you mentioned that, countries that have created operations in Mexico, they tend to work with countries or that are there, work with logistics companies that are of their country. But like, has there kind of been any other opportunities, whether it's for US based companies or even Mexican logistics companies that have popped up?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, I mean, it's just a really steep learning curve. The kind of rules of the game change frequently within Mexico as they, implement new rules and regulations. Thankfully, the NAFTA agreement, or as it's now known, the USMCA, no major changes over the last 5 years since it was, renewed in 2020. On the regulatory side, not as much, but definitely in terms of just like I've said many times, Mexico is still a relationship part of the world to do business in. Your reputation matters, your word matters, and companies like to partner with other companies that they trust and like doing business with. So that's a big challenge for newcomers to the marketplace to be able to establish that trust and reliability. And they're definitely looking to partner with companies that have been in this marketplace for a long time.
I feel like 90% of doing business with companies in Mexico is like, you need to know that guy who's like, yeah, no, they're cool. Like, you got to get the unofficial like head nod. But and as like annoying as that is from like an outsider trying to break in and like become part of that crew, that inside group, I do kind of like it. I do love that like a whole country still kind of operates like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I feel like the one other thing that's really interesting that's happening in Mexico is obviously there's this huge influx of business and opportunities and growth happening. And not only that, but it's a great time to be a carrier in Mexico. I feel like you got to be able just to like print money more or less. But one of the things that's interesting is that as a result of it, it happened all so quickly, because really up until we're 2024, like 4 years ago, this was kind of just starting, but it's really kicked off. And so everyone's had to hurry up and build an infrastructure and all of that. But I feel like one of the things that I don't know if I just haven't paid attention or if everyone else hasn't kind of caught on, but I feel like we're gearing up for a decent amount of regulations and rules and other things that are happening in Mexico, because as we've learned here in the US, something happens, it goes out of control, we introduce a regulation. And so I think right now I would be shocked if something similar did not happen down in Mexico, where it's growing. And I know we've seen it with the CCP, but I just would be surprised if there's not, I don't want to say a lot, but a decent amount of regulation to come out in the next few years.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think, all eyes from a Mexico logistics standpoint will be on the upcoming election. And regardless of who wins, how that president partners with the new president in Mexico, although I do, Claudia Sheinbaum, I saw recently her get quoted in the news, which I thought was very interesting, where they said, who would you like to win the U.S. election and who would you feel most comfortable partnering with? And she quickly deflected that and said, that's a decision for the American people to make. And regardless of who wins, I'm here to partner with and drive growth future forward. So I think regardless of what happens in the U.S., we've got a really strong partner that's pro-business in Mexico, and our hopes are that they really take away any barriers to trade and allow growth for the coming decades.
Yeah, I think that that is a politician answer through and through, and I have to commend her for totally answering the question, but also not answering the question.
Exactly.
So, kind of going back to that partnership, how are U.S. tariffs and the changes in trade routes kind of impacting that broader freight and logistics industry in Mexico?
I mean, I would say in a word, disruption. Again, we're talking about all of these new players coming in the market. So we're seeing it is a great time to be a Mexican carrier, but at the same time, their world is under a lot of pressure, right? There's increased levels of cargo theft, higher than ever before. The diesel fuel prices are higher than they've ever been before, and fixed in a monopoly. You've got driver pay increasing and the rise of the B1 driver going into the US. So it's really tough for Mexican carriers with all this freight to even get drivers behind the wheel of a truck. You're seeing interest rates, if it's 6-7% in the US, it's double that in Mexico. So while there is a lot of opportunity for Mexican truckers, it's a complicated market to make a buck. So in a word, we're seeing a rise in transportation rates. So many people competing for the same equipment, so rates are going up. And carriers can really pick and choose the business they want. So when we partner with our companies and customers, we really tell them, you've got to make yourself. I know that the phrase "shipper of choice" is worn out in the U.S., but in Mexico, it's still a reality. You have to make your cargo more attractive than the factory beside you. And that means, shortening loading times, offloading times, using, routes that are preferable for carriers, et cetera. So in a word, we're going through a lot of disruption, pressure in the marketplace. And while there's a lot of opportunity, it's also a real challenge on a day-to-day basis.
I feel like that's best described as the unfortunate growing pains, is that you just kind of have to figure it out. Just like everyone, every couple of years when things change here, you got to figure it out. I do like the part that there is a decent amount of technology that has come in as a result of all of these changes, especially here in the U.S. And I kind of like that Mexico can skip ahead over some of those technology growing pains. They can just kind of make the big jumps to the next things. I do like that point. But yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. It's now their turn to learn that, you can't be rude to your drivers. You have to not hold them there all day, every day, because they have things to do and lives to live. But yeah, I also, I'm curious as to, this is just pure speculation. I don't know if you would know the answer. I'm curious as to why more U.S. carriers haven't expanded operations into Mexico. So for example, like a enterprise carrier, like a JB Hunt, why they haven't set up an office in Mexico. Is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all of the large U.S. Trucking companies, like JB Hunt, Schneider, Swift, Werner, they do have operations in Mexico, but for the most part, they've decided to serve Mexico on an intermodal basis, just because they can get a lot quicker turn on their equipment, less wear and tear on the vehicles on Mexican highways, and just better control. So I think the large carriers are still servicing Mexico, but from an intermodal standpoint, without a doubt. And then just the regulations of and the reality of U.S. drivers actually wanting to drive into Mexico just doesn't work as it does in the opposite direction, where we've seen a huge rise in B1 drivers from Mexico driving for many U.S.-based companies on the U.S. side.
That, not me completely forgetting about rail. Just completely forgetting that that's a major thing, because I think two railroads or two companies literally developed a rail, a line that went from Mexico to Chicago and Kansas City. So not me forgetting about that solution. It's real cute, real fun. What a way to end on, what a way to end on, just completely forgetting about one entire mode of transportation. But it makes a lot of sense, because In this one specific instance, the rail moves a little faster and it holds more and you can get a lot more done. And you're not held up as much on the border because in theory, you've already cleared all of your stuff. It's already good to go and it just goes straight on through. So yeah, that would make sense why they've all moved to intermodal solutions.
They have, but in the same token, intermodal is essentially, at capacity as well. It's a decent alternative, but cannot replace truck. It's still a single digit percentage of the overall transportation market in Mexico.
In the meantime, I'll just see myself out when it comes to the rail and intermodal side of things. It's fine. It's fine. Moving on to something more funny than me forgetting about rails, is Jordan. We already know where you stand on hot dogs and sandwiches. So this time we need a little entertainment from you, and I'm going to need your best dad joke. And I feel like as a dad, you are overqualified to answer this question.
Without a doubt, I have several groaning teenagers in my house that bid on this one, but I wish it was a little bit more funny, but it's actually kind of a sad story, Mary, that I have to share with you. Given the current employment market, my cousin unfortunately was recently let go from his job. He's working at the M&M factory, and he was let go because his boss discovered that he was throwing away all the W's. True story.
It's the deadpan delivery for me. Well, that's a pretty high bar for someone to come through and break, Jordan. That is absolutely wonderful. Well, if someone has I don't know how they would get a better dad joke than that, but if someone wants to try, or if they have questions about kind of setting up operations in Mexico, or, the rise of countries setting up shop in Mexico, where can they find you outside the show?
Absolutely. Hit me up on LinkedIn anytime at Jordan Duart, and we'd love to discuss anything Mexico. And we always primarily try to be a resource to our customers. So any questions, we're always happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Mary. Have a great day.
Find Check All the Podcasts anywhere you get your podcasts, like Apple Podcast and Spotify. Don't forget to check out all the other incredible FreightWaves shows, and don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter on freightwaves.com/checkcall. See you on the internet.